So I'd like to begin our session today dealing with dysphoria and the fact that the world is waking up by putting some questions in a few moments to Dr. John Whitehall. He's the Professor of Paediatrics in Sydney. His 50-year career began at Sydney University, continued through developing countries and Western Sydney as a general paediatrician, then focused on neonatology before coming to his present work. For 15 years, he was Director of Neonatal Intensive Care in Townsville, North Queensland, which included antenatal diagnosis, resuscitation, management and transportation of premature, dysmorphic and sick neonates, many of whom were Indigenous. In Townsville, he was deeply involved in the establishment of the medical school at James Cook University, and for 20 years taught modules of tropical paediatrics in the master's program in the School of Public Health. In recent years, Professor Whitehall has also worked as a consultant physician in PNG, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar. And currently, he teaches and leads research and has duties in general paediatrics. Professor Whitehall is the author of quite a number of publications, one of them being Gender Dysphoria and Surgical Abuse. So I'll start with you, Professor Whitehall, this morning or this afternoon. You mentioned in your paper Gender Dysphoria and Surgical Abuse back in 2015, and I'll quote, "What astonishes me is the lack of evidence to support massive medical intervention aimed at changing a child's sex when such procedures are simply not necessary. The enthusiasm of ethics committees in hospitals, health regions, and universities for such procedures is an ongoing mystery." Can you explain that statement to us?
I can't explain. In some ways I can, in some ways I can't. The situation is exactly the same. That was 2015. It continues today. I have in front of me a report from looking at the Tavistock Centre in England, where the transgendering was occurring. And as we were saying back in 2015, there is no evidence to substantiate this or justify in any sense this enormous intrusion into the body, the psychology, the life, the family of the child. That's what we were saying then, and that's what this report is saying here, which essentially has led to the closure of that big unit, the unit in England. And they're saying through this many times, there are evidence gaps. There is not enough evidence. Nothing is known. They don't even call the giving of the puberty blockers and the surgery and the cross-sex hormones an experiment, because experiments have controls and comparisons and aims and things like that. Essentially, what is happening is that these children are being put on the blockers and then going to the cross-sex hormones. They're being castrated, quite frankly, surgically altered irreparably. Why? Because people have an idea that that's the way that psychological confusion about whether you're a boy or a girl should be treated. That's the issue. And things haven't changed, and things have got worse.
So you've been in the medical profession for some 50 years now. What's happened to the ethics of medicine in that period? Are doctors still required to commit to the Hippocratic Oath to do the patient no harm?
Essentially, yes, although we really don't take the Hippocratic Oath, but certainly that's true. But more than the oath, this is substantiated by law. For example, the case in which Dr. Rogers was found faulty by a Mrs. Whitaker because he did not, according to the High Court, because he did not warn the lady of a chance that he was operating on the eye. He did not warn her of a 1 in 12,000 chance that the other eye might react badly. And the High Court said that you have to tell the patient everything, the knowledge of which might cause them to rethink whether they want this or not. Now, within the context of the gender dysphoria, That was the big criticism in the Tavistock inquiry, that there was not any discussion of the side effects. And quite frankly, children's hospitals in Australia right now are continuing to say that the blockers which delay puberty are safe and entirely reversible. That is not true. There is ample evidence throughout the research world which says that the blockers have a sustained effect, and that the damage from the molecular behavior and so forth of the limbic system, for example, and therefore the cognitive ability, decision making, and so forth. I don't know how they get away with this, especially under High Court Whittaker and Rogers. I can only assume that maybe one day there will be a time of immense litigious challenge.
Okay. Thank you. So Dr. Dylan Wilson, in his document that he wrote back in May this year called An Open Letter to Australian Doctors, he claimed there exists a service at my local children's hospital and at other hospitals around the country to which I will never refer a child. I believe this service is not appropriate for children. It is actively doing harm. And this open letter is my way of reaching out to you to urge you to consider your role in this referral pathway. I'm talking about the paediatric gender service at my local children's hospital. Doctor, can you shed some light on Dr. Wilson's comments?
Well, he's frustrated, like a lot of us, that these places have characterized themselves by a rush to affirmation of the gender that the child is now declaring, without the intense, sustained psychological, psychotherapeutic looking into the life and the character of the child to work out why, in fact, the child is confused about the gender. That's the big issue which led to the closure of the Tavistock Centre in London. They were accused of then just rushing through to the clinical treatment as if the child knew that he says he's a boy and he really is a girl, as if he actually knew that. There isn't that analysis from it. Now, as well as the lack of analysis, as I was saying before, there is utter silence on the international studies which show that those blockers have got significant sustained side effects on the brain. And, for example, so do the cross-sex hormones. There are 2 international studies. I didn't do them, I just read them. Anyone can read them. But what they have done is measured with an MRI the size of the brain of an adult male who has been on estrogens as part of the cross-sex therapy. They attest, black and white, published, that the adult male brain shrinks at a rate 10 times faster than aging on administered estrogens after only 4 months. Now, nobody knows what the effect will be on the growing brain of a child. But these children, say from 16, are going on to the cross-sex hormones for the rest of their lives. Now, if I can read this, if I can explain this to you, why can't the Children's Hospital take this on? Why can't they at least respond to the intellectual challenge?
Wow. Dr. Wilson also referred to the tweets by the Liberal candidate for Warringah, Catherine Deeves, when she claimed that vulnerable children were being surgically mutilated and sterilised. Dr. Wilson indicated that it's because children are being surgically mutilated and sterilised. How can this be happening?
Because some people in positions of power have an ideology that it should happen, that this gender dysphoria is a real condition, that people can be born in the wrong body, and therefore this ideological pressure convinces the paediatricians and surgeons involved, and they are fortified by the ideological capitulation of parliamentarians. Because, for example, the law in Queensland essentially has criminalised efforts to oppose that affirmation. And they began that first, then it got a bit worse in ACT, and then the prize of all this, of ideological commitment to the affirmation of confused children, is in Victoria, where you can go to jail for up to 10 years, plus hundreds of thousands of dollars if you seek to obstruct or dissuade or turn a child away from the children's hospital and receiving the blockers and having the cross-sex hormones and being castrated. Catherine Deves was right. What do you call unnecessary castration if that's not mutilation? But that's inherent in it. But it's not just that. It's the removal of the genitals, fantastic attempts to create organs that aren't there and all this sort of stuff. At the same time, you have committed that child to a lifetime of hormonal and other medical treatment. You have made that child as dependent on the medical system as a diabetic. And in the process, you're affecting its brain. Oh, what do you call that?
Pretty serious.
In Victoria, that's a good idea. It's the idea that thinks it's good, that'll put you away for 10 years. And now while I'm at it, I might as well say, I mean, the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute, the 330 pages, you have to punish yourself to read this, but they're preparing the way for a bill down there. And I reckon they will be no less punitive than the draconian laws in Victoria, as opposed to the jail sentence if you dissuade or otherwise seek not to follow affirmation. But I think that, and you read there in the mumble jumble of these 330 pages, I could think you can discern the intent to stop free speech on this.
Yeah.
The Labor Party, from its National Congress, I don't know, 2 years ago, maybe 3, said there is a need essentially to prohibit public broadcasts that bring affirmation into disfavor. Now, I think that what's going to happen in Tasmania, they're going to take that step further. Sure, we can put you in jail if you do it. And if you talk about it, like on programs like this, that also will be a criminal act. They're very, very determined to do this. And I don't know how much time we will have, in fact, to discuss this, frankly, back and forth. I'm showing respect to them. I think they really believe they're doing the right thing. I think they're wrong. There should be a discussion. That's what the Cass report and the other people in Finland, they're saying there should be open discussion. Well, I reckon that the Labor Party in Tasmania is going to criminalise that. And then I reckon that's going to come back up the Eastern Board and be followed in Tasmania and so forth. So you cannot even discuss this.
Senator Roberts, I understand that you made the amazing claim in the Senate just last week that, and I quote, ideologically driven activists have intimidated the medical profession into silence and compliance with the affirmation model, rather than making a stand for our children who are in distress during adolescence and who need holistic or whole-of-person care. What's happened to the care of children, Senator, in the medical system?
Well, first, Andrew, let me please thank Dr. John Whitehall for his work and his courage and his integrity. It really is essential what he's doing and what he's saying. And secondly, I want to thank you and FamilyVoice for what you're doing. This is very, very important. And John just mentioned, I wrote down the words discussion. Discussion is the first step, and they're trying to silence discussion, which means they're censoring, which is a form of control. So underneath control, there is fear. They're afraid of their position actually being intellectually challenged. So that means they've got no grounds on which to stand. If they did, they'd present the data. But in answer to your question, what's happening to children's care, I've made a few notes here in response to your question. So I'll just read from those notes. The medical profession, in essence, is cowering and going along with the affirmation model. So many of the medical profession, like so many people in Parliament, are sheep. They just follow. They don't have Dr. John Whitehall's courage and integrity. So the affirmation means there's not enough discovery time around mental health issues. Just put them on the conveyor belt and get them cut and shut and hormones pumped into them, rather than going to the basic problem, which is that the child is having gender dysphoria. Now that's largely natural, as I understand it, for children to have some concerns about their gender or some questions. But when a person gets into gender dysphoria, it's a serious unease, and they need to be treated for that, not to have bits of their anatomy cut off and hormones pumped into them. So what we should be doing is we should be able to trust the medical profession doing no harm, but we can't at the moment. And I think that's a major problem, because what we've seen is AHPRA has interfered grossly in the last 2.5 years with the doctor-patient relationship. State laws are doing the same. And I stand by my words. There's nothing amazing about my words. My words are very simple and true. Ideologically driven activists. Children get on the conveyor belt of online support, just rammed into medical procedures, shamed if they don't continue, even though they may have doubts, not allowed to get anything other than affirmation. And so they cannot have a healthy discussion themselves. So only very, very brave medical professionals like Dr. John Whitehall stand in the face of accusations of being transphobic to save our kids. We've got to do something about the lawmakers and the medical professionals who are undermining our children's basic rights.
Dr. Whitehall, you mentioned that conversion or reparative therapy, in which the child is orientated towards its natal sex, is anathema to transgender activists. You said that the term reparative therapy, therefore, has a pejorative political ring to it. It is wielded more like a weapon than a description of a medical alternative. So has policy been hijacked in this country?
In a sense it has. I mean, and that's what's happened in Victoria. It's a confusing word, this conversion therapy, especially if you come from a Christian. It doesn't mean what we think. What they mean by it is that you would convert a child back to an identity which is congruent with its chromosomes, and that anything that you would do along that line is conversion therapy. That would be, according to the Victorian legislature, psychotherapy, traditional psychotherapy. And they would take it into the religious sense, prayer meetings and so forth. All of this then is attempting to convert the child back to that identity. Now that is a criminal act. 10 years in jail. It's hard to believe that. But that's the law in Victoria. It is, and that is likely to be transferred, we just said, to even discussing about it, because that has been their ambition.
Senator Roberts, you asked these 3 questions in the Senate. How has this gone on unchecked for so long? Why are these medical professionals not subject to disciplinary action for deliberately harming our children? What are governments doing while this is going on? Have you had federal or state medical bureaucrats contacting you for this evidence subsequent to your speech? Has the Federal Minister for Health spoken to you?
Neither the previous federal minister nor the current federal health minister have spoken to me. They've not reached out. No one in the Labor Party, no one in the Liberal Party, no one in the Nationals has reached out. Instead, what we get is smears and slurs from the Greens, because it is part of an ideologically driven agenda. Dr. Whitehall just said that just the use of some discussion to identify to the identity congruent to the child's hormones, child's actual gender is not conversion. It's human. Just having that discussion, it's entirely appropriate. And yet, Katie Gallagher has demonstrated her complete and her indifference towards what's happening in gender clinics in question time when she answered my questions. All she could say was, nothing to see here. Australia has the highest standards of medical care. Well, they're not being very caring. They're not listening to young people and not engaging with them. So the problem with the statement is that the gender clinic in Melbourne follows the same affirmation model as Tavistock, which is being closed down because it's failed to protect kids. And that should be ringing alarm bells. But Senator Katie Gallagher seems to be completely unmoved by it. This is not common sense. It's not done with integrity. It's just following a woke agenda.
You mentioned, Senator, that our children are making decisions that they can't possibly understand, decisions with lifelong consequences. They're being sterilised and denied full sexual function, and their brain development is highly compromised. They are being made sick when they're not physically sick. They've been denied the therapeutic support they need to help them with their distress. So has there come about some kind of a disconnection between our 7 Australian state and federal departments of health, with budgets running to the millions, and reality?
Yes, there has been, and there is. And budgets run not to the millions, Andrew, they run to the billions. And the costs of some of these consequences in the medical bureaucrats will eventually run into the trillions. So my answer is yes, they lack the data, they lack the care to even look at the data, they lack the conviction, they lack the understanding, they lack the humanity. What they've done is basically sold out to make money for big pharma. That's basically what they're doing. They're pumping these drugs into children. And yes, they're completely disconnected, not only disconnected between the parliaments and between the bureaucrats, but disconnected with humanity. They're completely disconnected with basic systems for raising children, the family unit.
So when we look at this, and you mentioned once again, I'm just quoting your speech back to you, Senator, that there is no care, I quote, there is no care when state government legislation denies parents their rightful place in support of their children in distress. Our children are not fodder for experimentation and advancing research outcomes for the medical profession. Our children are not profit centres for pharmaceutical companies. So who's in charge of the departments of health?
I'd like to know the same thing. I'd like to be able to answer that question. It seems to me that these initiatives are driven by an ideology, and they take on a life for themselves, a life of themselves. The people in charge of the Department of Health are people who show little regard for the gender dysphoria contagion. It's a real issue, but it needs to be dealt with therapy rather than surgical intervention or hormonal intervention. So this contagion is running right through our adolescent girls in particular, but also some boys, but particularly girls who are a major concern. So what we need this time in particular is family support, and sacrosanct. Instead, we have, as Dr. Whitehall mentioned, state legislation across Australia will fine or even jail people who are seen to not support the affirmation model. And Victoria, even their consent is not even a defence. Even if the child consents to having some discussion or therapy, that's not a defence. I mean, that's inhuman. That's immoral. So our children are being left defenceless, and their place of belonging becomes the online support network and eggs them on, but isn't really where these kids, really the support is not there when these kids have to face their anxiety and depression, which is fundamental, as Dr. Whitehall just mentioned. And they need to come to terms after the interventions with their damaged bodies, and then have to live with it. And it's in a state where their mental development, their brain development, their hormonal development, they haven't gone through puberty. They're not whole. So, and they would sense that. We know that there's been an increase in suicide after this intervention. So, you know, these children are not adults, and they're not capable of making that decision. And they realized later that it was a mistake. And that's absolutely disgusting.
It is indeed. Dr. Whitehall, you mentioned that, talking about the blockers, the puberty blockers, you indicated that though they are used for an abnormal state since the 1980s, blockers have only been used in the presumably normal brain for gender dysphoria since the 1990s, and therefore in neither case is the effect known in later years of life. You said the claim that they are completely reversible is not yet based on evidence. Is that still the case?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. Now, certain things, if you're blocking the system of hormones that will bring about stimulation of the ovaries and the testes, and you will then get secondary sex characteristics. If you stop it after a certain period, then yes, the whole process of getting secondary sex characteristics may then come back. However, what has happened to the brain is a different matter. And this is the work of Neil Evans and others in the veterinary school in Glasgow, for example. They've put out maybe eight or 10 papers along these lines. You give it to sheep in a pre-pubertal state, and you put them on blockers, and look what happens to their brain. They show that the limbic system is affected. That's the system which coordinates emotion and memory and decision-making and things like this, and leads you to a sense of identity and where you're going to go. The limbic system is interfered with. They sent chunks of the brain, the sheep are very happy to contribute, I understand, to Norway, and they found that the function of many of the genes in that were altered, so that there was a histological basis for it. So what happens to them then? You put them into the maze and see how the sheep go. Well, they became much more emotional, and they lost their memory, their working memory, and so forth. And then they look at them later on and found that these effects were sustained. So there are sustained effects on the brain. Rats have also been shown. You put them on the puberty blockers and they behave differently. And what is interesting with the rat studies, and true with the sheep studies, is that I assume they become so timid that they prefer the familiar to the new. This is an important thing, because if you allegedly put the child onto the puberty blockers to give it more chance to work out whether it's a boy or a girl. But in the meantime, the familiar is the supportive, encouraging voice of all the authoritative figures in its life, usually a parent, often the mother, and the school teachers. The kid is now the pennant girl or boy in the school, and so the media, all this then becomes the familiar. So I think that this provides a physiological basis for what we know. That is that once you start the children on the blockers, almost all of them will go on to substantiate their gender change by taking cross-sex hormones. So it's there's a physiological basis for these things.
Wow. So Dr. Dylan Wilson has written, Professor, that the only way to bring this to the fore is if, as a profession, we stand up and push for that scrutiny. We need openness from the clinics. We need honesty. We need acknowledgement of the truth. What more should be done?
I don't know. What, in a sense, I'm tempted to feel defeated on this matter. The only thing in Australia which is encouraging is that Tavistock has moved away from it, and so has the medical profession in Finland and Sweden.
Right.
They are moving away. Why? Because they had people who were prepared to look at all this sort of evidence. Now, do we have people here like this? 250 of us signed a petition to the Minister for Health a year or two back. Please, sir, this is all the sort of evidence. There were 83 references to it. Would you please organise an independent inquiry into the functioning then of these gender clinics? 250 people. I was the primary, ultimately was my name on it and a reply to me. I never, ever got a reply. What we do know was that the request was then passed off to the Ministers for Health in the States, who then passed it to the College of Physicians and the AMA. And you've got these little groups of really powerful ideological people who govern basically the publications of those organizations. They're taking it over in that sense. People get too tired to fight with them, or they don't want to fight with them, or whatever reason. So, okay, what more can we do but write what we intended to be as a very erudite reference, backed up, respectful request to the federal Minister for Health, and he doesn't even reply. He just gives in to the little powerful groups that actually end up being the vocal, sources of vocal stuff from the colleges.
Right.
You tell me what we should do.
Well, this is what I'm thinking myself, is that it really comes back to the integrity of the family, and the family being prepared to stand up to these supposed experts who aren't experts and saying, no, I don't want our 14-year-old daughter to have her breasts removed or some other part of her body. Because what's been happening is that the family's integrity has been repeatedly transgressed here. And so what we need to have is very strong and firm parents.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I'm not giving anything away now. I know people have contacted me from one of these states that has criminalized attempts not to dissuade, who criminalize activities that don't lead to affirmation. Okay. 2 girls, teenagers, behavioral alterations already. In other words, there's a sort of a neurological issue to do with behavior, attention deficit, autism, this sort of stuff, right? 2 girls come home, announce they're boys. What do? They go on the web. Where do they get the idea from? Their mates on the web. And now they've got all sorts of advice as to what to say and how to behave and who you should contact for your support. So they go and declaring that they want to become boys. What these parents are united. What can they do? The girls make their way to the clinic. The clinic said, yes, they know what they're talking about. They really are boys born in the wrong body, blah, blah, blah. One of them's 15, nearly 16, when that person can decide for themselves. The parents are powerless. The parents then seek opinions from other doctors, too frightened. Other psychiatrists, oh, no. Other psychologists, oh, no. Counselors and so forth. And what is the message coming back is, oh dear, well, this is the way, this is the modern way of approaching it, and you better like it or lump it. So that's when the parents are together. I could give you other stories when the parents are not together, and you have got one parent, and quite to my initial astonishment, it seems usually to be the mother. And the mother then is in the process of transitioning this child. It's a boy usually, or she likes the better in a dress and whatever. You have got one parent then who can get on the web, find out the way to do these things. All sorts of lawyers, all sorts of committees, all sorts of gender things come in to help her. What can that other person do? We're powerless in this.
That's an issue. So, yeah, so Senator Roberts, Dr. Wilson has written that we are in the midst of a medical scandal. This is happening under our noses. So, yeah, what else can the general public do?
Before answering your question, Andrew, I just want to acknowledge Dr. Whitehall's comments. He belled the various groups that are driving this and behind it, or enabling it rather. We've got activists driving it, but we've got various medical guilds. We've got state health entities. We've got the federal health bureaucracy. They're driving it. We don't have a medical system anymore. We have a medical racket. And that's been shown by the last 2.5 years of gross mismanagement in response to the COVID virus. The family, secondly, is also under attack. So the first thing we can do is recognize the problems and recognize their root causes. The other thing as part of the problem is recognizing that this is still experimental. They don't know the consequences. This is gross mismanagement. It's gross dishonesty. But as to what people can do, the first thing people can do is to vote, and vote differently from the 2 tired old parties that are enabling this to happen over the decades. That's a very, very important thing. But it comes back to what Dr. Whitehall said in response to parents. The parents are the critical backstop. The parents are the critical last port of call, because when they see this gender creep of ideology in the schools, the parents need to push back. And I would like to see charter schools, but that's not something parents can do straight away. Charter schools give the principal and the parents the authority again. Also, parents can push back when we see transgender children in, say, a boy who identifies as a girl, or a boy who's transgendering to a girl, or if he or she wants to bunk down with the girls, well, the parents need to stand up to that. It comes
Yeah.
back to the parents. The parents need to reclaim their ground of parenting, and the medical professionals need to unite. And so parents need to lobby their ministers, lobby their members of parliament, lobby their senators, lobby state and federal members of parliament, lobby their doctors, and get people to support. There are so many doctors and politicians who are just sleeping and not awake. Once they're awakened, they become very, very strong. We've seen that in Parliament. A handful will wake up. We can see that in the doctors. There are some very, very good doctors and nurses, and we need to wake them up, because quite often they're not really seeing it. It's just being taken for granted, just sliding by. So the parents need to wake up. The parents need to wake up the politicians and wake up the doctors, and vote differently.
So one thing that parents could do, if they find their children in a situation, possibly at school, where they're coming under all of this propaganda, they can actually withdraw their child and homeschool them.
Yes, I agree. That's a very, very good response. But not everyone can homeschool, especially if you've got two working parents. So when you look at it in that sense, Andrew, when I was raised, which was 50, 60 years ago, my mother stayed home to raise me. And that was the model.
Right.
These days, with the tax system, with so many over regulations in our country, with high costs of living, all due to government, all of those things due to government, and particularly the federal government, people can't afford to stay home. And so we're neglecting our children. And this is one of the consequences. And that's when the activists come in and prey on that.
Yeah, well, this is interesting. So, Peter, do you have any comments coming in from our viewers to the panel?
Yes, I have.
Questions?
Yes, I do have some questions. Andrew, ready for me to go with those?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, the first one is probably Malcolm to start with, and then John could make a comment if he wishes. What political and/or anthropological ideology is driving this mutilating activity?
Well, we've belled that cat for many, many years. Senator Pauline Hanson belled the cat back in 1996 when she was in the Parliament, in the lower house and House of Representatives. The United Nations and the World Economic Forum are driving this. The United Nations is on a path to convert the world from freedom to control. I mean, don't rely on me. Check the United Nations senior bureaucrats' own words. They're not accountable, and what they want to do is put in place an unelected socialist global governance. Again, not my words, senior members of the UN, senior members of the World Economic Forum, Davos. What they're saying is that they want to control the world as well. Of course, they say it much more nicely. You will own nothing and you will be happy. But that's what they're after. They're after digital identity to control us. They're after ways of removing cash so they can control our currency, and then have a social credit system. That's the agenda driving this. And they want to destroy the family, because when you destroy the family, people turn automatically to the government, Peter. So that's the answer. This has been orchestrated, and it's been orchestrated ever since the UN started in 1944. And that was one of the reasons for starting the UN. We've got a small group of globalist predators who want to control the planet, take us back to feudalism instead of the free enterprise system and freedom of individuals that we had as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And that's what's driving this. They're driving the smashing of the family, the conversion of sexuality, the conversion of genders. They want to just upset the whole apple cart and get us dependent on government again.
Dr. John Whitehall, do you have a comment on that?
I have wondered for a long time where the ideology would come from. I can see coming is a utopian idea that free sexuality, that is to say diversity, change, how many promiscuity, whatever you want, is argued, looking back by some of them, to a mythical society of ancient Greece, where allegedly everyone was happy because this is the way they behaved. And that if only the family could be broken down, in that sense, if only restraints could be broken down, that people would be happier. This is a utopian ideology, therefore. If you look at it in a Christian sense, it is a salvation, a salvific ideology. This is we have defined sin, which is restraint. We have found a way for salvation, which is doing away with restraint. And in the process, a new perfected human being will arise. Now, I've sort of caricatured it, but I think myself, it lies in that area. And therefore, in a sense, you have to give them their due. They really believe in this ideology. They really believe they are creating a new human being. That is a helpful thing because you don't underestimate their commitment there. In a university near me, there is a Department of Education in which is actively seeking to have sexual diversity taught to all levels of school, they say. And these people went, when Latham's bill came up, they argued in the New South Wales Parliament that parents did not have the right, should not have the right to know what their children were being taught. And that it was important, therefore, to teach all these things. Why? Basically, to create a better society. So I think that is part of that ideology, and then it moves slightly sideways. And you don't necessarily need to be a boy and a girl, and you can change practically. One thing leads to another. But I think that the whole issue is the consequence of an idea, and that is an ideology. There is no basis in biological fact.
Thank you, John. This question's for John. It's a bit technical. I don't even understand it, so I hope you do. Are Australian gender clinics acknowledging the reality of ROGD or denying that it is a valid diagnosis?
Well, what they're talking about is rapid onset gender dysphoria. In other words, 10, 15 years ago, say, it was mostly boys who grew up thinking that they were girls. And you could see that there was in many of them, as is the case, many of the families are disrupted. And you can say the mother doesn't like men, she's been badly treated by men, all this sort of stuff. And the little boy is much more appealing in a dress. And the little boy rapidly learns that the way to bring a smile to mum's face is in fact to go along with this, and so forth. Now, allied to that may well be that this is a very good way to have a crack at the male, the man that you want to wound when you turn his son into a girl. So there are these things in the past. However, in recent times, say 10 years, the phenomenon has changed, and it's not young people, it's now teenage girls who are coming out of the woodwork and declaring overnight, almost like those two I mentioned to you, hey, we are boys. So this is the concept of rapid onset of gender dysphoria. Where does it come from? Well, I think it comes from the web. There's a community in the web, there's encouragement, there's instruction in the web and so forth, funneling them, teaching them how to say things and so forth. And indeed, by accentuating, I'm happy now I changed to be a boy, accentuating the alleged benefits to it. Now, allied to that, and this has not been fathomed as far as I can see, that I wouldn't be surprised if there was an influence also from the web, but with regard to pornography. This was not my idea, but I thought when I heard it, I should have thought of that. That maybe these girls are watching all sorts of crude and punitive and dreadful pornography, and maybe they're thinking, well, I don't want that to happen to me. I think I might join the winning side, so to speak. So this is a social effect, and that led by the girl, which is first name, Littman is the last name, she wrote this up, and she was saying this phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria is a social contagion. And before that, quite frankly, I had used the word of a psychological epidemic, which is a similar sort of thing. I think that this is a psychological, societal, cultural thing, which is leading these girls to think that somehow or other there is an advantage to being a boy. Now, the problem with that is that once they get to, once in the court, Australian court, let me think now, 2 girls at the age of 15 we know about had their breasts removed, 1 at the age of 16 and 2 at 17. So it can lead rapidly to irreparable change over this. When the federal court abrogated its gatekeeping role, no records have been kept, and that happened about 3 years ago. We don't know how many girls are now having their breasts removed. Mutilating surgery, I would agree with Catherine Deeves, because they are convinced that they're doing the right thing, and there is an ideological impetus that allows it, encourages it, will put you in jail if you don't go along with it.
Yeah, thank you, John. Malcolm, did you want to make a comment on that?
I think John said all that needs to be said. He said it very well.
Okay, thank you. There's another one for Professor Whitehall. Can you comment on the ethics of affirming gender clinicians that defend affirmation on the grounds it is compassionate? Is this compassion warranted or misguided, a dereliction of responsible practice? Can the children truly consent?
No, everyone, most people would agree that a child cannot conceive of what reproduction is going to be like, fatherhood is going to be like, or what gender it is, what is sex actually like in the future. This is beyond their experience to comment upon. So I personally don't believe that the children have that capacity. Now, I've forgotten, what was the first part of the question?
First part was
the ethics.
The ethics of the affirming gender clinicians.
Yeah. There is no evidence. Look at this. This is the whole CAS report here. The whole thing was closed down. Why are they saying? Because there's no evidence that this affirmative therapy works. Full stop. Everybody is saying that of any consequence like that. There is no evidence. Even the people who are proposing it are saying that there is no evidence. This is a sort of a given. There is no evidence. So, okay, so how can one of these ethical committees, where is the ethics committee in the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne, that would allow this? And it's not even experimental. This is an ideological imposition, physical imposition. There's no substantiation for it. How do they allow it? I don't know. We have tried to point out the lessons of Whitaker and Rogers, 1 in 12,000 chance. You're not mentioning any of this. They simply refuse to enter the ring and debate the issue of all the articles talking about the side effects of blockers, the side effects of cross-sex hormones, the issue of detransitioning, the issue of higher suicide rates later on. They don't talk about this. How do they get away with it? I don't know.
Thank you, John. Malcolm, this question possibly for you. Can legislation be proposed that would mitigate the present effects of this ideology? What are the possibilities?
Legislation can be proposed, and if the federal government puts in place legislation through the House of Representatives in Canberra and the Senate, then it takes precedence over state laws. What are the prospects when you've got a Labor Party government, a Liberal Party that's heavily woke, and you've got a Greens Party that's pushing the agenda? I think the chances are very, very small indeed. So I hope that's an answer to both parts of your question.
Thank you, Malcolm.
But what we should be doing, Peter, sorry to take it back again. What we should be doing is making sure that we continue our efforts to discuss this, to raise the facts about this. As Dr. Whitehall just said, there is no evidence, so there's no ethical basis. We need to do that, need to continue pointing that out. And eventually the tide will turn and the facts will come out. And we've seen the tide turning in the European countries, Finland, Sweden, France, I think, and we're seeing it now in Britain. So it'll eventually turn. But because people need to recognize that neglect of children is a very cruel outcome. It is not a therapy for children in distress. We need to recognize children facing gender dysphoria or experiencing it are in distress. And that needs to be the focus of what we need to do. That needs to be the focus, not cutting bits off them or changing their hormones.
Thank you, Malcolm. John, did you have a comment on that at all?
No, just to emphasize that all sort of epidemiological reviews are showing that the majority of these children have comorbid mental health issues, some very, very serious. You would call autism very serious. In the CAS report, I was surprised, the Tavistock people were saying that about a third of their people were autistic, a third, which is an incredible number. And we already know that autistic kids have a disordered sense of reality. And so do we really think that they ought to be operated on and given hormones when they can't think straight to begin with? This is the absurdity of it. Most of the children have comorbid mental issues, and most of the people come from broken homes. So this is called attachment issues. And this is what Westmead Children's Hospital showed, that a large number of their children had these attachment issues, and therefore it's probable that they were not thinking straight. And yet we think they're thinking straight enough to have their gender changed. I mean, it's a madness about it.
And then I think, Peter and Dr. John Whitehall, I think what we need to do is go dig a bit deeper and find out why there is 1/3 of children today have autism, or at least Tavistock's people have autism. Patients have had autism. And then secondly, why are the families breaking down so much these days? They're the two fundamental causes.
I agree. The two, see, when I was first a pediatrician here in the 70s, people would come. I had a very big pediatric involvement here. People would come and frankly discuss all sorts of things about their children, sexual issues and so forth. In all my time here, first time around, 15 years I was out here, nobody ever came and said that he thinks he's a girl. Whereas people would come, yeah, he's masturbating in public or he's sticking things in orifices, you know, they were not, it's not as if they didn't enunciate their problems, but nobody to me came. And when I polled 22 of my colleagues with a cumulative experience of 931 years, they could only remember from those years 12 children who were confused about their gender. 10 they remembered because of the severe comorbid mental disturbance, and 2 had been the victims of prolonged sexual abuse. In those days, we used to teach, look, if the kid's confused about the gender, she's a girl and she says she's a boy, is she being abused? Now, that was what it was then. Now we know that hundreds of children are coming. Well, what is different? Well, culture's different. And there aren't as many fathers around, quite frankly, and nobody seems to be getting, I'm exaggerating, of course. And I think that the raking up of the family and then the influence of this iniquitous web have combined to bring about this problem.
And I also think, Dr. Whitehall, that in the period you were talking about, or the time of which you're now discussing, you weren't faced with censorship. You weren't faced with fines if you dared to express your opinion as a medical practitioner. And that is something that's really heinous right now. You can't talk, you can't give advice to a person suffering from gender dysphoria, as much pain as he or she may be in. You can't give advice to them about how to consider what's going on in their lives. And if you do that, you could end up in jail. I mean, that's wrong. That you're a doctor and you've got to give your frank and open advice. And you know, that censorship is the hallmarks of a controlled society, and control, always beneath control there is fear. They don't want the people to think, they don't want the people to discuss, because all it's about is control. And I mentioned the reasons why earlier.
Yes, no, I agree. You can't. I think it's the ACT law, as well as certainly the Victorian law, which basically says it's a criminal act to induce somebody not to go ahead with affirmation. And what does that mean? That could be a public broadcast, on a radio broadcast. That could be a prayer meeting in your home. It could be anything. If you don't even have to practice psychology, all you have to do is to induce somebody to seek to change their commitment to affirmation. That's a law. And it's not a simple law, they put you in jail for that.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'll
Get
hand
around
over.
this. I mean, I can't imagine how Victorians, I'm in New South Wales, I'll tell you that. I can't imagine how Victorians accepted this. Now, the Labor Party certainly put it in, but we spent a lot of time talking to various people in the Liberal Party. And when this, oh yeah, you speak to them, yeah, well, no, I understand, I do understand, no, they count on me, so to speak. When the vote came, when the vote came with regard to criminalising conversion therapy, all but 2 Liberal people voted for it. And a number of those I had spoken to beforehand and gave me every reason to think, oh, well, I don't have to waste any time. They understand. All but 2 voted for it.
There's the real problem, governance.
Well,
And,
thank you.
look at the Minister for Health. Didn't even acknowledge the letter by 250 doctors.
Yeah. From doctors.
Yeah, 250. And
Thank
it was
you,
all
gentlemen.
respectfully written, dear Minister, all sort of stuff, bring it to your attention. And it was all referenced. Like I said, 83 references to the side effects and other things. He didn't even reply.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll hand back over to Andrew now because we're nearly run out of time to wrap up.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your contributions today. I was going to ask you to give us a 90-second conclusion, but I think we've just about run out of time anyway. And I think your last 5 minutes or so had been very good comments in terms of concluding your thoughts on the matter. Yes, so we appreciate your help with us, your sharing in our panel, and we hope to see you once again on one of these at some time in the future. Thank you both.
You can
You're welcome, Andrew.
Interview me through.
Okay.
It's been an honour to be with Dr. Whitehall, and I thank you, Andrew. Keep going, because it's so important that we have independent news media like this to get the real views out.
Great. Thank you.